Gungaga.
So, how about that Final Fantasy XVI, huh? I've been hyped as all hell for this game ever since it was revealed all the way back in 2020. A full mainline Final Fantasy game developed by the development studio behind Final Fantasy XIV. One of the greatest MMOs of all time, if not one of the greatest games of all time. Please go play Final Fantasy XIV, seriously. Headed up by the ever-incredible Naoki Yoshida, and with the combat director of Devil May fucking Cry? Sign me the hell up. Every little bit of footage that's been released to this game looks phenomenal. From the trailers, to the official gameplay, to the playthroughs of the recently released demo by various creators, I have never been sold harder on a game. And yet, there seems to be a small contingent of gamers who are dead set on hating this game. I understand that everyone has their own opinions, but some of the hate that I've seen online towards this game is honestly just insane. So far, I've managed to nail down 3 specific criticisms that are being commonly levied against the game from fans. Those criticisms being that the game isn't turn-based, that the game is too focused towards the West, and that the game isn't Final Fantasy. There's also some more stupid criticisms, but I'm going to ignore those in this video. I'd like to talk about these criticisms that I've heard, and give my thoughts on them. Now, I do want to be clear that I do not own a PS5 and have not been able to play the Final Fantasy XVI demo or buy the game yet. Patreon.com/NightParadox. So, technically, I have no horse in this race, but I still wanted to give my thoughts as just a fan of Final Fantasy. But before we begin, say it with me, folks. Never take anyone's opinion on Twitter too seriously. So, first up is that the game isn't turn-based. Apparently this is a much more common criticism over than the Japanese side of the fandom, which I can't really speak for because do I look like I can read Japanese? To understand this, we have to remember that Final Fantasy is basically one of the granddaddies of Japanese RPGs, alongside Dragon Quest. From the very beginning, Final Fantasy was turn-based, providing the foundation for RPGs to come down the line. Therefore, I can see why some people want Final Fantasy to remain turn-based. It's been that way for so many years, so why change it? Well, this really just comes down to one of the harsh facts of life, guys. Things change. Even in the older Final Fantasy games, things were gradually added to make the gameplay more action-packed. The active time battle system was added so that your enemies can move if you take too long selecting your actions during your turn, adding a fast-paced element to combat. By the time of Final Fantasy XII, you were able to move around freely in combat and effectively play the game like an MMO. This trend of moving away from turn-based combat has been occurring for years now. It isn't like Final Fantasy XVI suddenly decided to make the shift. Newer players who aren't old heads who have played every Final Fantasy ever made have been playing more action-based Final Fantasy for years now. Naoki Yoshida actually talks about this in an interview with Game Informer. In the interview, he states, "While a lot of older fans are used to what Final Fantasy had in the past, a lot of younger players have never played a Final Fantasy game. They grew up playing first-person shooters. They grew up playing games like Grand Theft Auto, where you basically press a button and something happens immediately. It's not a command-based system. When you press the square, your guy shoots. Why do you have to wait for him to shoot? I should be able to press square and he shoots immediately." You have this whole generation of gamers that grew up with this, and you need to get those generations to come in and also play Final Fantasy XVI, which has this image of not being that type of game. You have to make it appealing to that group as well. And so to get that group to come in and introduce themselves to the series, we decided to go down this route. Action was pretty much the only way. That's why I'm not too bothered by the switch to full action combat. Yes, it's different from what came before. This is also the developer's way of keeping Final Fantasy relevant for current tastes. I understand if someone prefers turn-based to full action. Hell, I love turn-based combat. But to attack the game and the developers over it is insane. If you don't like it, you don't have to play it. Simple as that. The next criticism is the fact that the game is marketed towards and focused on the West. This shift shows in everything from the art style to the story. This game marries the aesthetics of Final Fantasy such as chocobos, summons, and magic with a more realistic art style and a story and tone that's straight out of Game of Thrones. As you may expect, some fans have taken umbrage with this. I personally choose to see this as just the developers wanting to do something different with Final Fantasy. Over the years, we have had so many Final Fantasy games that are extremely geared towards Japanese audiences. Young male protagonists, crazy over-the-top settings and stories, and lots of just weird shit. By appealing to the West, the developers can introduce Final Fantasy to a whole new generation of gamers who may have never played these games before. As gamers, we have to remember that we are not the center of the gaming universe. There are so many people out there who barely play any games. And on the opposite side of the coin, there are people who play every friggin' game ever made, it feels like. For those people who don't play a lot of games, if they see a game that doesn't appeal to them, there's no way in hell that they're going to bother to play it. This tonal change may entice a lot of new players to give Final Fantasy a shot and see if they like it. In my eyes, that can only be a good thing. More fans means more support for the series, and more support for the series means more games get made. The final criticism that I want to touch on is a rather vague and nebulous one, but it's one that I hear crop up a lot. That criticism is the idea that this game isn't true Final Fantasy, quote unquote. I've seen justifications for this ranging from the realistic art style not being Final Fantasy, or the darker tone not being Final Fantasy, or a litany of other reasons. I find this criticism to be extremely stupid. It's stupid because, well, what is Final Fantasy? Really, think about that for a minute. I don't think Final Fantasy really has one true definition of how it needs to exist. This series has existed for over 35 years now. In that time, it has changed so much in every entry that's basically unrecognizable from what it was at the beginning. We went from a super basic plot that was basically a D&D campaign in game form to these massive epics of storytelling that helped pave the way for gaming being taken more seriously as a medium. We've gone from medieval guys in armor to Tetsuya Nomura's anime-as-hell creations. We've gone from basic turn-based combat to MMO style and action-based. Just about the only things that are consistent about Final Fantasy are the name, the prelude, and the chocobos. And even that second one I think is kinda inaccurate. There's no one definition for what a Final Fantasy game must be. Final Fantasy is just a basis that the developers use to create new stories and characters and new experiences that touch our lives in ways we can't expect. To demand that every Final Fantasy stick to the same template is just advocating for lazy game development, honestly. Do you really want every game in a series to be damn near indistinguishable for all time? I really don't think you do. So, those are my thoughts on the criticisms I've heard levied against Final Fantasy XVI. Ultimately, these are just the words of some crazy nobody fanboys on the internet, so you shouldn't take them too seriously. Still, it is interesting to talk about them. Sometimes it's important to analyze criticisms and understand where they come from. It can give you new insight into the series that you love, and why others love them as well. I sincerely hope that Final Fantasy XVI ends up being as good of a game as I've hyped it up to be, and that it brings tons of success to the development team. They've clearly put their heart and soul into this project, and I cannot wait to see how the full game pans out. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm gonna go rob a bank so I can afford a PS5 finally. Later!